Hello, podcast fans. Welcome to the Punk Rock Priest Podcast. I am your host, the Deacon of Drums, the Priest of Percussion, the Bishop of Beats. At least that's what Jeff Two Names calls me when he introduces me on stage. But I am your host, Kevin Weidinger, aka the Rev Kev, and this is episode 2. This week I sat down with my friend, the Dr. Ned Rinalduci, professor of sociology at Georgia Southern University, also known as the former Armstrong State University in Savannah, Georgia. We talked a little bit about his article that he recently wrote for Connect magazine about the need for sociology in our liberal studies curriculum for colleges, and in general, a broad approach to education for our college students and how that creates better civic-minded and informed citizens. We also talked a little bit about sociology and his work in systemic racism and the study of the systems that prop up racism in our country. We also talked a little bit about what it was like to teach those sorts of classes in the Deep South and some of the experiences he's had in that. Ned and I met years ago when I was the campus minister for Armstrong, and we used his classroom to do our lunchtime gatherings for the Armstrong Wesley Foundation. But Ned and I are also graduates of Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida, and we talked a little bit about that, but unfortunately we didn't have time to bring up a conversation that crossed both the discussion of systemic racism and our beloved alma mater. On July 24th, the statue of Francis Epps, who was the founder of the seminary that eventually became Florida State University, was removed from campus. Epps was the grandson of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was his mother's father. And like Jefferson, Epps was a slave owner. Epps made his fortune in Tallahassee as the owner of a cotton plantation. There were actually 2 votes, one in 2016 by a student group and another by a panel in 2018 that were non-binding votes, but votes nonetheless, to remove the statue of Francis Epps from campus. Interestingly enough, I think the original reason it was removed in 2018 was because of construction. It was moved to another place on campus, but then last week on the 24th, it was removed from campus for good. Also in the news recently was a petition to change the name of the stadium. It was started by a former football player. The stadium is called Doak Campbell Stadium. Doak Campbell was the president during the time in which Florida State became Florida State University. Prior to that, it was the Florida Women's College, and he oversaw the transition in 1947. Doak was also instrumental in the forming and bringing athletics to Florida State University, and he oversaw the beginnings of the stadium that would eventually be named after him. But the reason for the petition was the fact that Doak was a staunch anti-desegregation person. He did not want Florida State University to desegregate. As president of the university, Doak Campbell would pressure the student newspaper to spend less copy space in talking about desegregation. He forbid students to go to desegregation meetings. He actually kicked a student out of school, a grad student, for publicly supporting a black candidate. So Doak Campbell has no business having such a prominent building on campus being named after him. And if you don't know Florida State University, it's not just a stadium. There's an entire building wrapped around the stadium that houses the athletic department, as well as a club on the other end, and classrooms and offices that go all the way around the building. It is one of the most prominent and visual buildings and edifices on campus. And so somebody like him really has no business having that prominent of a building, or any building at all, having his name on it. And so the suggestion of the petition is to simply change the name of the stadium to Bobby Bowden Stadium. If you know anything about college football over the last 20 or 30 years, you know the name Bobby Bowden. He was the football coach at Florida State for 30 years and is a beloved figure in Tallahassee and at Florida State University. And no one has done more for athletics at the school than Bobby Bowden. I could probably talk about this for another 30 or 45 minutes, but instead, how about we jump into my conversation with my friend Ned Rinalduci. Enjoy. Well, welcome everybody to the Punk Rock Priest podcast. I am your host, Kevin Weidinger, and standing by is my lovely assistant, Daniel Garrick. Say hey, Dan.
Hey, how's it going, y'all?
This week, our guest is Ned Rinalduci, Dr. Ned Rinalduci, professor of sociology, lover of soccer, Florida State University alum, and my friend. How's it going, Ned?
Very good. Good to be here.
So when I say go, what do you say?
Knowles?
Yes. Good. Hey, well, it's like pulling teeth. Okay. I guess that was kind of that one is not as obvious. Ned and I both went to the fabulous Florida State University many, many years ago. I don't think I would get in now.
I don't think I would either.
Oh, so this week we wanted to talk with Ned a little bit about his field of sociology and some of its implications in systemic racism. And I want to talk to him a little bit about the anti-intellectual movement that seems to be popping up, and then maybe get his opinion about the state of Georgia's college ruling about masks and in-person class, if he's willing to jump down that rabbit hole. But first, Ned, tell us what sociology is.
That could take a while. We'll keep it to the brief. First day of intro class. Sociology is literally the systematic and scientific study of society, of social institutions. We look at everything from the micro to the macro. So we're talking about looking at analyzing everything from personal relationships to culture. We do comparative work between societies. So, it really can go from very small to very large. It includes everything from studying, things like romantic relationships to crime and deviance, to politics, to economics, to education and other social institutions. So it's a very, very wide open social science.
So what has been your kind of niche in that?
I have primarily looked at cultural movements, political movements based on national identity and based on religious identity.
Okay, cool. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the article that you wrote for Connect Savannah, which is a local arts and entertainment weekly newspaper in light of the Savannah Morning News not being the greatest newspaper in the world. Connect actually fills in pretty well with all sorts of things other than putting Dan and I and our band on the front page like they did a few months ago. But you wrote an article about why the subject of sociology should be on the forefront of education for higher ed. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, we, as the situation post George Floyd has caught the attention of so many Americans, and there was clearly this desire by so many Americans to understand more about things like systemic racism. There was such a desire to even acquire the most popular books on anti-racism and systemic racism, and Amazon was out of the books that are the sort of new go-to books in the area, which shows there is this desire for people to learn more. And one of the points that I made was this is sociology. This is what sociologists do. And, we're sitting here at a time in Georgia where they're talking about cutting back on the core curriculum. And cutting back on the core curriculum means that more classes like sociology, there may be less of it in the core and fewer people are going to be exposed to it. So when we sit there and go, why don't people understand the realities of racism? Well, maybe it's because if they haven't been exposed to it properly. You can't get through an introductory sociology class without being exposed to some level, some research, some data that will help to explain the realities of systemic racism. And in my intro class, we go into so many different areas, pointing out that we live in a society where the experiences of people of African descent and European descent are fundamentally different. In the article you were talking about, one of the things I say is, if a black man and a white man both commit the same crime in America, the black man is more likely to be arrested for it. If that black man and that white man are both arrested for the same crime, that black man is more likely to be tried for the crime. If a black man and a white man are both tried for the same crime, the black man is simply more likely to be convicted. If a black man and a white man are both convicted for the same crime, the black man is more likely to get a longer prison sentence. Literally at every step in the criminal justice system, this is the case. And this isn't something that's debatable. This isn't something that, well, that's not, I don't feel that, because sociology, we're social science. It's not about feeling, it's about data. And this is all research that has been done over and over and replicated, and there's no arguing with it. This is simply the reality. And, with sociology, you're exposed to that reality. You're exposed to the research. You're exposed to theories that might challenge your worldview. People have a hard time with things like privilege. People say, "Oh, I'm not privileged." Well, if social class has held you back, then yes, you have some disadvantages. But there is white privilege is very, very real. And these are things that as sociologists, we sort of take for granted. We talk about this in every class. We talk about this all the time. And what I noticed is I'm particularly reading the world of social media, God help us. There's all these people I know that have college degrees that don't seem to have any understanding of how discrimination works. And it occurs to me that this is ultimately a failure of higher education. It's a failure of the universities and the colleges that they went to, that they were never exposed to this information. So my article that you referred to in Connect was really just a sort of blowing the horn to say, now is not the time to be cutting classes like sociology. Now is the time to be mandating classes like sociology so that we as a society can be better educated on these things and make informed policy-related decisions.
Yeah, I remember in your article you talked about how part of the emphasis early on in American colleges was having a broad liberal understanding so that we create a well-informed populace. And that seems, as budgets change, and that seems to not be the emphasis anymore.
We have totally lost what education used to be about. I mean, if you look at Thomas Jefferson, an icon of American history. Of course, he's getting a lot of criticism these days too for the fact that he was a slave owner. Fair enough. But if you asked Thomas Jefferson, what do you think your greatest contribution to the United States was? He was asked. It was not anything he did as the third president of the United States. It was not anything he did as the Secretary of State. It was he founded a university because he understood that a democratic country could not operate. You can't have a functional democracy without an educated populace. And therefore, his greatest contribution to the United States, he felt, was creating the University of Virginia.
Yeah, that was actually a big emphasis in, I want to say, if I remember my church history correctly, towards the turn of the 20th century, the Methodist Church played a huge part in starting universities. For that same reason, they believed that educating the populace would do all sorts of good things for society.
I mean, and in many cases, you could say we can see what the outcome of a less educated electorate is already doing around our country, and that is one of the points that I was making, particularly as universities, as you were saying, because of budgetary restraints, and because of the fact that most universities are state universities and beholden to the politics of their state. We are moving away from the sort of well-founded education that created an electorate that could think critically, that had a sophisticated understanding of the world. And without that sophisticated understanding of the world, without being taught science and understanding science and science as method, without knowing history, without appreciating arts, literature, and humanities, we aren't educated. I mean, you can have there's millions of Americans with pretty nice degrees hanging on their walls, but they're not educated. They don't have a sophisticated understanding of the world. At the same time, there's some people who are very well read and well traveled, and maybe they don't have a degree, but their understanding of the world is sophisticated enough to where they are in fact educated. So we are failing our students and our alums when we graduate these people without this sophisticated understanding of the world, because they went in to get the job they couldn't otherwise get. Their degree was about job training and not about education, and that is, one of the failures of our system, and one of the reasons we're in a place where we are right now, where people can't seem to figure out what's true and what's not true concerning pandemics, and it's we're in a very frustrating place right now for educators.
So tell me, I think it's interesting. You teach at a school in the South, in the deep South, Georgia Southern, and you teach sociology. I actually met you when I was the Methodist campus minister, and we used your classroom for our lunchtime meetings. I mean, that's when we met, and I would wait for you to come out of class, and your classes were huge. And all of the students at what was then called Armstrong State loved your classes. When I talked to the students about their favorite professors, your name always came up. So I don't know if you know that or not, but there you go.
It was always nice to hear.
So tell me about your experience teaching these concepts in a classroom filled with kids who grew up in rural South Georgia, and the cognitive dissonance that they experienced. Tell me about, if you have like stories of people who had massive transformations or blow-ups in class. I remember my sociology class at Florida State. I always got pitted against this super conservative kid, and in the class was just conversation back and forth, and the professor would interject every once in a while, and most of the time it was me and this conservative kid arguing with each other, which was probably not very beneficial to the rest of the students. But tell me about your classes and your experience of teaching these students with very broad experiences growing up.
Well, it is a challenge. We are in South Georgia. Oftentimes I'll try to break things down by using myself as an example. I was born in the South. I was raised in the South. So, the culture that I was born into is at the very least adjacent to the culture of someone. And I'll use myself as an example. We talk about something like white privilege. And I'll say to them, I'll go, look, I am a professor. I have a PhD. I'm a doctor. And I like to think it's because I'm brilliant, because I'm just so smart and I worked so hard to get here. And I will keep telling myself that. But I would be a terrible sociologist if I could not reflect and go, you know what? My dad was a college professor. My dad was a psychologist. Education was always valued in my household. It was never a question. When I got older and realized, wait, some people don't go to college? I didn't know that. I talk about the fact that, I lived in a neighborhood where I went to public schools, but they were really, really good public schools. This is all privilege. This is all things that I was born into. I didn't earn the right to go to these good schools. I didn't earn the right to have well-educated parents. The language, the English that was used in my household was proper in terms of grammar. It was good standard American English, not a lot of slang, not a lot of accent. All of those things were huge advantages to me in the world of education. Made it much easier for, say, me to get a PhD than it would someone who was born into a family with less educated parents in poverty. So I try to sometimes use myself as an example of what privilege is, because white privilege is a very, very real thing. You can say I've been discriminated against by A, B, C, and D, but my race has never held me back. I use the example of my son. I'm not proud of the fact that he's been pulled over a couple times in the past year while speeding. But as a young white man, he doesn't think, oh my God, I better keep my hands on this wheel and not move, or I might get shot. That's not part of his reality. But it is part of the reality of young African-American males. To try to make some of this stuff, real to my students, I will use a lot of personal examples. And well, I haven't had a lot of issues of, the situation you described of your sociology class. I have had some. I'll often lecture on things like the Confederate battle flag, for example, because there's throughout the years, lots of big fans of Confederate symbolism have come through my classrooms in the last couple decades.
That's hard to believe.
I'll start out by talking about the meaning of symbols, how symbols acquire meaning. And usually I'll start off with, say, a swastika. A swastika is for Western society, has come to symbolize only very, very negative experiences: anti-Semitism, racism, white supremacy, Nazism. As I'm sure you well know, the swastika is far older than the Nazi Party.
Right.
It's been used all over the world, all cultures, from Asia to Europe to North America, indigenous tribes, and everywhere it's ever been used, it's always meant something positive and life-affirming.
Right.
Well, all that positive, life-affirming stuff is not what we think about when we see it today.
Right.
If you saw someone with my haircut and a swastika tattoo, you wouldn't think, I wonder if he's a Buddhist.
Right, yeah. Or somebody with my last name with a swastika on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we talk about how symbols acquire meaning. And with the Confederate battle flag, what I talk about is oftentimes I'll show them the official flag of the Confederacy, the one that flew over Richmond with the red, white, and red stripes and the blue patch, the one that now looks the new Georgia flag is based on. Right. And I'll talk about that as the official flag of the Confederacy, but it doesn't bring up the same emotions as the other one, because the other one has been used in a different way. It's become associated with different things. So when white supremacists are burning crosses, you'll see the Confederate battle flag. When the Dixiecrats marched out of the Democratic National Convention in 1948 because Truman was talking about integrating the military, they marched out under the Confederate battle flag. After Brown versus Board of Education, Georgia put the Confederate battle flag on their state flag, and South Carolina raised it over the state house. These were a symbol being used for political purposes. Therefore, its meaning was acquiring all of this racist baggage. Thus, it has become the symbol of controversy where the other one hasn't. And that does always lead to some discussion among students where people will say, well, I have that bumper sticker on the back of my truck, and I'm not a racist. And like maybe similar to your experiences, I've had some wonderful students. I once had a non-traditional African-American woman stand up and say, I've been sitting next to you all semester, and I don't think you're a racist. But please understand that when I see you driving down the road and I see that bumper sticker on your car, you've got to know that is exactly what I think of you. Yeah. And those kinds of interactions can be meaningful.
Yeah. So let's kind of pivot a little bit. I had a very interesting conversation via Facebook, social media, recently in my new Berg, Briarcliff Manor, New York. There is a Briarcliff Manor Facebook page. And so there was this long conversation that ensued from a student, or I guess an alum of the high school, who was hoping that the school system would start a education program on anti-racism. And this conversation erupted in the sense of, I've never experienced racism in Briarcliff Manor. And I chimed in, and I knew I shouldn't have. And I said, I've only lived here 2 months, but I've seen plenty of examples of systemic racism. One of which is, or was, because this has changed since then, interestingly enough, the Briarcliff Manor parks are only for residents. And several of the little villages around here, the wealthier villages, have a similar code. But interestingly enough, the little towns that have lower income families and immigrants don't have those rules. And I pointed out that that is an example of systemic racism. I said, the people who live in this neighborhood or in these villages aren't necessarily racist because their parks are like that, but that is systemic racism. So I was just wondering if you could expound upon my very flimsy example of some other examples of kind of the insidious forms of systemic racism that are present today.
Well, let's jump off from your example. Real estate, housing. There's the old term redlining.
Right.
Redlining was took its name from an actual time when bankers or insurance companies would actually draw red lines on maps around neighborhoods that did not merit financial investment. Because it was just, and not racism, just bankers' logic. It's not good investment. But of course, that's not the case. These were minority neighborhoods. These were Black areas. These were immigrant areas. And even though we may not see red lines drawn around neighborhoods the same way we are today, we still see the effects of that. And the example you gave is a perfect example of that, of what we're talking about. But we also still, to this day, we live as a segregated society. There was a study of America's 5 biggest cities found that, Blacks and whites have very little interaction outside of work and school, because the neighborhoods we live in are segregated. Our families are segregated. So our social groups are segregated. And some of that has to do with where we live and how we got in that situation. And there are advantages and disadvantages throughout this system. Today still, if you look at which neighborhoods get the most loans versus which neighborhoods get the least loans, white neighborhoods are advantaged. Same with insurance policies. These things haven't gone away, and they absolutely have a cumulative effect with all of these other types of discriminations and systemic racism, making it much, much harder for people of color in the society to simply do the things that so many of us take for granted. When you look at how socioeconomic status is still correlated with race and ethnicity, and then you look at something like how we fund public education. We fund public education through property taxes.
Right.
Well, that means very rich areas are going to have great schools. They're going to have good teachers. They're going to have technology. There's one study estimated that 1/4 to 1/3 of teachers today are not competent at doing their jobs. Well, at rich schools, almost all of them are.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in those areas that have a low property tax base, because poor people live there, you can't get blood from a stone. You're funding through property taxes, so you have a poor district. It's going to have high teacher turnover. It's going to have less technology. It's going to have facilities that aren't as great. And then you expect people from those rich schools that are going to be more often than not white, and these poorer schools that, because of the correlation between socioeconomic status and race, are going to be overrepresented by people of color. And then we expect them to be able to compete equally. Well, that's not fair. They can't be expected to compete equally. And that's a perfect example of the kind of systemic racism that we're talking about.
Yeah.
There are a couple examples I always like to think of. And, one of them is FDR, who is arguably one of our most progressive presidents and my favorite president. But when he was passing the New Deal, they were handing out home loans to people, to pull us out of the Great Depression. And the compromise that even FDR made was that we won't give those housing loans to Black people. Or Robert Moses, who was building our interstate system and decided that he would build underpasses so that city buses couldn't get out to public beaches on Long Island.
That was an example I gave.
A long history. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And these are great examples of things that we need to be teaching in history classes, because this is part of the history of America. And we have there is a strain of thought in our culture right now that if it's not positive, don't be teaching it. Why do you hate America?
Right.
Which it comes from such a place, a sad place of ignorance. The people who I believe love America the most are those who can see it for what it is, and with all its bruises and bumps and evil that has occurred in this country. It's part of it, and the whitewashing, excuse my term there, of American history is been a detriment to progress in our country.
Yeah, I was telling somebody the other day, I remember in high school, I think my junior year, was taking American history. In the Tallahassee, the school system in Leon County is great. I mean, it has Florida State right there. So there's great young teachers coming in. There's not a lot of private schools. Like a lot of other southern places, there wasn't all of a sudden a bunch of private schools that shot up conveniently around desegregation. And so we had amazing schools, but I remember a history class on a test. I got a bad grade because I said that the Civil War was one of the reasons was because the states wanted to retain the right to own slaves. And the fact that I wouldn't just put states' rights, my teacher got bent out of shape, and I told her, I'll take the F, but I'm not gonna leave out the truth.
You have to say a state's rights to own slaves.
Oh, she didn't want that. Yeah, no, that's what I put eventually. And like she wasn't having it. And I love this teacher, and I had a great rapport with her, but it is. And I think some of the folks that I've told that up north are surprised by that, because that's not necessarily an experience that they've had in school, but certainly in the South.
It is the exact same as my experience. And I went to high school in Atlanta, clearly in the South, but perhaps a progressive hub in the South. Didn't matter. Right. The basketball coach that taught me Georgia history taught us states' rights, and it was not about slavery. And of course, you can't then you then go to a university where you're taking history classes from actual historians, and you can't get away with that anymore, because that is not history.
Right. Well, and I told the person, I said, it wasn't necessarily that the teacher was racist. It was part of the curriculum. Yeah. It was the curriculum that was approved to use. And I'm sure your basketball coach had the same experience. That's what he was told to say.
And politics absolutely gets involved in curriculum. And in the South, the lost cause and the myth of the lost cause and all the Southern myths that have become the myth history that's why we're debating monuments and how we teach.
Absolutely. I always like to ask my guests a very different question. What are you listening to these days, Ned?
The old 97s just released the second single off their yet to be off their new album, and that's actually what I was listening to this morning.
Yeah.
Butch Walker has put out a rock opera.
Oh, he has?
It's definitely worth checking out. It's a politically progressive rock opera. In fact, so related to things we've been talking about. It's about, if you're not familiar with Butch Walker, he grew up in Cartersville, Georgia. Yep. And it really is about a Southern man growing up with racist parents And it tells the story of a young man growing up as a racist and eventually changing his ways and growing old with a son who's gay that he ends up accepting and loving. And, it's sort of this journey, perhaps not the most popular sort of rock operas aren't a big genre these days, so I don't know what he was thinking commercially, but it's also great music.
I mean, he was part of, to me, one of the best, least known bands of the 90s, the Marvelous Three.
Yes.
Did you ever see them play?
I've seen Butch solo, but never with the Marvelous Three. And of course, he was the primary songwriter and singer. And
he actually, they were so amazing live. He tore his Achilles playing live one time. That's just how much energy that he had on stage. So, Butch Walker is amazing. Now he's a big-time producer.
Yes.
Well, Ned, I appreciate your time with us. We'll probably circle back around to you before too long because, the world's a crazy place and we all need a good sociologist to help us make sense of it.
Well, happy to do it anytime. And we miss you in Savannah.
Well, I appreciate that. All right, guys. Well, thanks for listening